now it gives me great pleasure to introduce our 4 panelists for this session on smart cities. We've got some great people lined up. Firstly, we've got Marina Jarotka, Professor of Human-Centered Computing in the Department of Computer Science at the University of Oxford and Governing Body Fellow of St Cross College. She leads an interdisciplinary research group investigating the responsible development of technologies that are more responsive to societal acceptability and desirability. She's an EPSRC established career fellow. She's conducting a 5-year investigation into developing responsible robotics for the digital economy. And she's director of the newly established Responsible Technology Institute at Oxford and co-director of the Observatory for Responsible Research and Innovation in ICT, Orbit. And that's great to have you, Marina. We'll come to you in a moment. Welcome. Also, we have Andrew Loshman. Andrew is the co-founder and chief operating officer of Field Effect. Andrew brings a 20-year background building and managing IT security products and programs, including 13 years in government and defence, as well as security policy development within the Government of Canada's Privy Council Office and contributing to national security. Welcome, Andrew. Awais Rashid is Professor of Cybersecurity at the University of Bristol. He heads up the Cybersecurity Group at Bristol and is director of the EPSRC Centre for Doctoral Training in Trust, Identity, Privacy and Security in Large-Scale Infrastructures and director of Refrain, the National Research Centre on Privacy, Harm Reduction and Adversarial Influence Online. Bit of a theme emerging there. Welcome, Awais. And last but not least, we've got Andy Stanford-Clark. He's the Chief Technology Officer for IBM in the UK and Ireland. And Andy is an IBM Distinguished Engineer, a master inventor with more than 40 patents, and IBM's quantum computing leader for the UK. Andy's based at IBM's Hursley Park laboratories near Winchester and has been working in the area that we now call the Internet of Things for more than 20 years. So welcome, panelists. If I could start first with you, Marina. Why is it important, if we're designing and building a smart city, that it's citizen-centered?
Thank you, Reid. Okay, I think it's because citizens and citizen groups, they're going to have ideas. They're going to have great ideas about how technology could work for them and particularly for their communities. And more so, they have the crucial local knowledge that's going to enable the creation of tailored solutions of that technology. They have the right to participate and the right to have a say in what happens to their cities. If you don't involve users and stakeholders in that design, then all the decision making is on the part of the designers and innovators who are creating the tech or those who might procure it. And the priorities that they have might be very different to those of their communities. The worst scenario is that people feel as though tech is being done to them rather than something that they have a say in, and then they might not accept changes very easily.
Thanks, Marina. Andy, from an industry perspective, what would you say to that question?
Sorry, we have to repeat the question again. It was so long ago.
So why is it important, if we're designing and building a smart city, that it has the citizen at the centre?
Yeah, of course. Well, ultimately, the citizens are going to have to live there. So we can design all the tech and get all the engineers to go, oh, it'd be really cool to have one of those. And, oh, we should do this, we should do that. And this bit will help sustainability, and this will help reduce the carbon footprint, and this will make it easier to access for all the lorries, and we'll float stuff down the river. But at the end of the day, if people don't want to live there and it's not a pleasant experience, then they're not just mice being put into boxes. They're people living in houses and going to work and accessing shops and restaurants. So it's got to be a pleasant environment for them. So it really does have to be a proper design thinking, proper user-centric design.
No, thanks for that, Andy. I mean, I suppose when you think about it, it's sort of obvious, isn't it? But actually, maybe that's not always the case. Awais, if I could move on to you, what mechanisms can we use to design, build and operate smart cities to make sure that they're citizen-centered?
So I think Marina already touched on this a little bit, and I think the term co-design is often thrown about quite easily. but I think it's much harder to actually really take citizens' perspectives into consideration when you're designing systems. And I think we should also think about that there is not a singular citizen. There are a range of communities, people from a range of socioeconomic backgrounds, and they have different needs. So I think when we talk about co-designing, we really have to ensure that all these citizen stakeholders have a clear voice and they are actively engaged, not just at the first stage, asking them what your requirements are, but really asking what will work for them, where they will come up against challenges, and how to surmount those challenges in the first instance. Because unless we do that, what we end up in a landscape where citizens, they almost kind of butt heads with technology rather than actually utilizing its benefits. But it can also pose really huge challenges with regards to inclusion of particular socioeconomic groups. It can also lead to all sorts of senses of sort of exploitation, for example, in the large scale data that is often collected in these kind of environments. So I think it's really, if we want to really do co-design, we really have to think about how do we engage through a range of engagement mechanisms, these different citizen stakeholders, but at the various stages throughout. And finally, the cities are long-living infrastructures. So it's not just a one-shot thing. You have to make sure that there is constant feedback and listening to the people who actually live there as to how to improve what we have built in the first instance.
I mean, that feedback sounds really, really important. Andrew, if I could come to you again, from an industry perspective and maybe a security perspective, what would you say to the sort of design, building, and operating a smart city? What does that mean for you?
Sure. I look at things through a security lens. And for me, when you look at smart cities and some of the infrastructure that is required to be able to develop it, trust and confidence by citizens in that infrastructure and the data therein is absolutely essential. So if you take a look at 5G mobile, just as for instance, which will be a critical enabler for smart city design, understanding how those systems are architected and implemented, and how data flows through them as a forethought and not an afterthought is absolutely essential to getting the trust and confidence in citizen access and connectivity right. One of the key ways to get this is through a process called security assurance, which is the act of understanding large systems, looking at source code, looking at how they're deployed, and to be able to articulate when and why a particular technology is safe to use for the purpose that it's been deployed. So trust and confidence and enabling that in a structured way would be absolutely essential.
No, that sounds great, Andrew. So having security professionals, secure by design, brilliant. Andy, if I could come to you, who else should be involved in building a smart city, and who gets to decide, who's involved in that?
Well, it's a really good question, because there's a temptation to let a building company come in and say, okay, we're going to build some houses, and oh, by the way, we'll use the latest building regulations, which have got to be absolutely up to date, and but therefore we're putting solar panels on the roof and we've put little USB sockets in the plug outlets, and that's as good as it gets. But in fact, there's so much more to it than that, obviously, for a smart city. And so I'm working with Fawley Waterside down here in Hampshire. And we've got a core technology group that's many years before we put the first spade in the ground. We've got people from the comm side, people from the IT side, people from academia, people from a range of industries who basically bring expertise to say, before you do anything, start with the internet layer underneath the ground and build it up from there. And then there's all the logistics and services and low carbon transport and how we're going to bring food onto the site. All this has got to be considered ahead of time. And then finally, people who are good at building houses will build according to what's been specified. So you just need that massive range, and it includes banking and insurance and just all sorts of industries have to be involved up front, because that's not the core competence of people who build houses.
So when we're building Golden Valley in Cheltenham, we really ought to be broadening things out. Yes, Marina, what do you say?
Well, I mean, I agree with Andy, but in addition to the technical kind of infrastructure, I think if you take a responsible innovation approach, which is essentially democratic, you've got to involve lots of different types of stakeholders, lots of different types of groups of people, and those that are going to be affected by the technology. So we might think about, you talk to the young, to the children, to elders, to ethnic minorities, to the vulnerable, to travelers, to mothers and baby groups, and cyclists and pedestrians and the homeless, and people who care about local wildlife, which often get missed out. Everyone that we can possibly think of we can engage with their views on what a smart city might mean for them and how that might impact them. And a further point, just to relate to something I've said, is really to ensure a kind of responsible development and deployment of technology, so that technology, whatever we're putting in place as a part of that infrastructure of a smart city, is actually responsibly deployed in cities and then evaluated by the people who's going to be impacted by that and whose lives and day-to-day routines will be transformed. Because if we do that in an iterative way and incrementally, then we manage their expectations, we carry them with us, and we learn so much about that kind of local context as well.
And that sounds really helpful. Awais, if I could come to you and maybe move the conversation on to a bit about privacy. Why does privacy matter in such large-scale settings? And what would you say a citizen-centered notion of privacy would look like?
So I think we don't have to go far. We can look at the range of news that we have seen in recent years, from large-scale collection of data by big organizations and the risks that come from having that large-scale collection of data. Now, if we think about it, a smart city is on even a more massive scale. A wide range of services collecting data about users to make real-time decisions, but users becoming catalysts of composition of those services, where a user walking through a smart city with wearables actually creates a composition of services. Now, there is this really fundamental question, and this goes back to the point that Marina was making about responsible innovation. Should privacy be an afterthought? Absolutely not. I think the key is that we have to ask the question, what kind of future society and smart cities do we want to live in? And do we want to think about after the fact, now we have collected all sorts of data, how do we actually make it more private? Or do we start by building more privacy preserving mechanisms into the core infrastructure? Going back to Andy's point, it's not only about cables and stuff. How do we decide what is the privacy we are building into the core infrastructure, so that anybody who's then building services and everything on top of it can actually utilize that core privacy primitives, rather than saying, now I'm going to collect all the data and think about some access control on it? Surely that's not good enough. So I think we have to ask the question, what is it that we can do with users' data to get value out of their data in a privacy preserving way, without massive privacy violations of citizens? And what does the citizen-centered notion look like? I think the citizen-centered notion looks like that people should have agency over deciding what they want their data to be used for and what not, and it shouldn't be complicated. We've all gone to a website and found the enormous kind of complex cookie thing. That is one website, okay? Imagine living in a smart city and having to do something the equivalent of that. It will totally disempower users. So I think the keyword here is agency. If I can understand what happens to my data and do something with it, that's what matters, and that's not simple to do.
So agency for privacy, brilliant. Andy, any thoughts from your perspective on privacy?
So, it's all about informed consent. What you were just saying there, if I understand what people are doing with my data, most people don't understand what high-tech companies do with their data these days. And often it's hidden in the terms and conditions that you sign away to say, in order to have this service, I'll let you have all my data and do what you want with it. That's no longer acceptable. So it has to be informed consent, because if you're running a smart city on data in the same way as in Industry 4.0, you're running your business on data, that is the lifeblood, the core essence of the city. And without that data, if people withhold their consent, then all sorts of things can't happen. So people, as Marina said, you've got to bring people with you, and that's a journey. You can't just put a massive tech spec in front of them and go, this is what we're going to do, because 99.9% of the population will have no idea what that means, even if they nod their head and go, yep, that's fine.
So we're thinking about confidentiality, I guess, of data, but let's move on to availability and thinking about resilience. So I'll stay with you, Andy, and then we'll maybe go to Andrew afterwards. What about resilience in a smart city, Andy?
This is an interesting problem, because not only have you got the day one system, which is all shiny and new and it works great, and the first people move in and they start using stuff. So first of all, there's the bit you don't anticipate, which is what people will do with your system, all nice and shiny and working perfectly as long as nobody touches it once they start using it. But then you've got the long-term life cycle, as Away said at the beginning. This could be a 40, 50, 100-year program. And you've got to not only keep the systems running, but also move with the time. So as new technologies come along, you've got to take those into account, bring them into the system. So there's the whole sort of DevOps pipeline for a city is immensely complicated and many dimensional. It's not just the same as deploying code to a server. You're bringing in people's lives and people's livelihoods and people's communities and their social lives are all part of this fabric. So it's a very, very complex sort of organic computer that you're dealing with here.
Andrew, any thoughts on resilience and availability in a smart city?
Yeah, absolutely. If you look at resilience as the ability of something, an organization or technology to return to form after being compressed in some undesirable way, I think that we have a pretty well demonstrated history of in technology and in business of not being resilient to cyber threats and cyber attacks at a level that would be commensurate with having an effective smart city and a trusted smart city. And so I think we need to think long and hard about what autonomous responses look like and distributed technology, the different modes and modals in which these new technologies are going to be deployed and sensors and their interconnects, I think is really quite complex. If you look only at recent events, whether it's the Continental Pipeline in the United States and critical infrastructure there, or related technologies such as IoT and the Mirai botnet, I think it's all too easy to understand that there are significant impacts that are possible. And if we're going to measure how well we are in terms of resilience today, how well we're doing, I would say that we would need to be extremely thoughtful here.
No, that's really, really helpful. We're run out of time, actually, folks. I really wanted to start talking about climate change, climate emergency, and smart cities, but we might have to leave that for another session.